Our panel this morning is to be chaired by Bill Kristol, and you have brief bios in your material there, and so we're not going to spend time reiterating everybody's curriculum vitae. Bill Kristol will be known to virtually all of you for a number of reasons. He's been active he was one of Jim's students at Harvard. He taught at Harvard for a time following his PhD, his work there as a student. Has held a number of positions with a number of different leaders in Washington, D.C., and you'll see that in his bio. He currently, as all of you will know, is the managing editor of the Weekly Standard. And Bill, I will have to admit that at my house, we keep the New Yorker and the Weekly Standard side by side, not only for ballots, but the covers are both just really interesting, even if I don't have time to read all of the articles. So we're delighted that you have come and appreciate your coming, and I'm going to let you introduce your panel.
Well, thanks, Jim, and thank you for calling us together in this fitting tribute to Jim Wilson, a great scholar and a remarkable man. Roberta, it was not any imposition at all for us to come out here. It was really a pleasure and an honor when we were all invited. We, of course, automatically did our best to come to pay tribute to Jim and also to have an interesting discussion about his work and its implications. Jim Wilburn also stressed to me that the weather in D.C. would be horrible at the end of February, and it would be so great to come to sunny Southern California and get a couple of days away. So it's all the more important to have a good conversation about Jim Wilson and his work. It's a great pleasure to moderate this panel of the usual suspects, as Roberta nicely put it. They need no introduction. They're both students of Jim Wilson's, friends and colleagues of Jim's at different times. John DiIulio actually, of course, co-authored the American government textbook for years with Jim and other work as well. Shep worked with Jim a little earlier and remained very close to him through the years. They're both genuinely distinguished political scientists. I would praise them and say they're two of my favorite political scientists, but this conference might be being recorded, and I don't want to damage their academic futures.
Too late, Bill.
Yeah, you think, right. So I will, without further ado, ask Shep and then John to make some remarks about the work of James Q. Wilson, and particularly focusing on the moral sense. I'll say a few words, a little discussion, and then open it up to the audience. Shep.
Thanks, Bill. I was hoping Bill would say two of his favorite Democrats, but...
Well, that's easy, yeah. It's a very low bar, though, you know.
It begins.
Yeah, right.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I particularly want to thank Jim Wilburn, who put an extraordinary amount of thought and consultation into planning this, and it really shows such a great panel, great conference. Although Jim Wilson considered The Moral Sense his most important work, many of his students and his admirers disagreed with that. They placed bureaucracy, political organizations, and his extensive writing on crime above his later, more philosophical work. Until recently, I probably would have agreed with that assessment. But after reading The Moral Sense a second time, much more carefully this time, I've come to appreciate the way in which it pulls together many of the strands of his thought over the years. It offers the basis for a reorientation of our contemporary thinking about studying politics. The Moral Sense is too complicated and subtle a book to try to summarize in 10 minutes, so I'll limit myself to highlighting some of its key themes. In doing so, I hope to refresh the memory of those of you who know the book well, inspire those of you who have not read the book to read it. I guess it's available right outside. And provide some thoughts about the foundations that the book provides for the teaching of public policy. In The Moral Sense, Jim Wilson used his vast knowledge of modern social science, and I should add, modern natural science, to undermine two foundational beliefs of contemporary social science. The first is methodological individualism, and the second is cultural relativism. He argues that modern science provides more support for Aristotle's pre-scientific understanding of human nature than for the assumptions that underlie almost all modern economic, sociological, and political science work. As a result, most social scientists, even our usually reliable friends in economics, will view the moral sense with deep skepticism. Adam Smith, maybe, but Aristotle, that seems 2 millennia too far. Thoughtful non-academics, in contrast, will probably consider the moral sense interesting but hardly revolutionary. There seems to be so much common sense, and it seems so consistent with how most of us view the everyday world. In fact, this contrast between our inherent moral sense and the amoral precepts of modern social science is a theme that runs throughout the book. In important ways, modern social science is at odds not only with the way most of us see the world, experience the world, but it's also out of touch with how most of us act in the world. I think Jim took particular delight in pointing out some of the contradictions in the behavior of academics. He delights in pointing out that even professors who insist upon the fact-value distinction and maintain that justice is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger still teach their children to share their toys and still leave tips at restaurants. We also, most of us, vote, a highly irrational act. Wilson's also, one of the more amusing parts of the book is he points out that most people are not content to be free riders. But there's one exception, and that is people who have taken graduate courses in economics. It sometimes takes years of graduate education to dampen our moral sense. Of course, Wilson's most basic heresy in this book is to claim that we can speak scientifically about human nature. Human nature has been shaped by evolution, and paradoxically, natural selection has provided us with genes that universally require us to develop conventions that differ from place to place and from time to time. In fact, we're the only animal that by nature and by natural selection needs convention. The moral sense is in a large part a search for the most basic universals that underlie this diversity. The most important of these universals is our capacity for sympathy. As Bill Clinton would say, and I won't try to do an imitation, I have the capacity to feel your pain. In Wilson's words, natural human nature includes the capacity, quote, for being affected by the feelings and experiences of others. My utility curve, in other words, is intertwined with the utility curves of my friends, my family, and to a lesser extent, those of my fellow citizens. I think one of the most interesting parts of this book is the way in which Jim discussed the relationship between sympathy and judgment. He said sympathy involves sympathy not just for everyone, but those who we feel judged to be worthy of our sympathy. For example, few of us would weep over poor Bernie Madoff rotting in jail. But we're saddened and angered when we hear the fate of children horribly mistreated in North Korean prisons. Bernie Madoff may look like us, but we know he deserves his fate, and we know those North Korean students do not deserve their fate. Not only does sympathy lead to judgment, but the standards that we use to judge others, we eventually apply to ourselves. In order to live up to our own judgments, we need to develop self-control. I think more and more we're learning from psychologists just how important it is to teach children to resist the temptation to eat those marshmallows before them. And if you haven't seen the marshmallow experiment, I encourage you to go on YouTube and to Google it. And as Mark Kleiman has pointed out in his paper, it's important to teach parents how to discipline their children in a way that they would live in predictable worlds. Now, Wilson did not deny that some people lack a moral sense, but we call these highly unusual people psychopaths, and we question their humanity. Nor does he deny that developing sympathy, self-control, and reciprocity, in a sense of duty, take training. In fact, the importance of habit in developing moral sensibilities is one of the important commonalities between Wilson and Aristotle. But almost all people in almost all places at almost all times somehow do develop these key human traits. As much effort as Wilson developed to the study of criminality, he was even more impressed by the fact that the vast majority of people do not become criminals. This requires some explaining. The moral sense does not begin with the epigraph, but an appropriate one might be Mark Twain's wonderful line, "Man is the only animal that blushes or needs to." It's part of our nature to judge others, to judge ourselves, and to fall short on the many occasions and to feel the sting of conscience as a result. So you might ask, so what? Didn't we all learn this in Sunday school? I should add, even those of us who attended rather sporadically and didn't pay much attention when we're in Sunday school. And I note that because there's not much, John will continue on this, but there's not much discussion of religion in this book, which is quite an interesting omission. Those of you who have yet to read this book will be disappointed to learn that Wilson doesn't provide us with any moral precepts to apply. Indeed, like Aristotle, he maintains that human nature can rarely produce us with rules for action, but only, quote, a grasp of what is good for human life and a rough ranking of those goods. Indeed, he viewed the search for universal abstract moral principles with skepticism, and to some extent with trepidation. As moral beings, we are locals, not cosmopolitans. Our moral sense has given strength by actual human beings around us, not by abstract arguments that we read in books. That is why moral judgment can be dangerous as well as essential for human life. Our natural sympathy for others and our desire to be thought well of others led some people to protect Jews from the Nazis, but unfortunately many others were led to participate in the Holocaust without even accepting Nazis' racist ideology. Now, if we don't get moral principles from this book, what does it teach us about the study of public policy? I'll just mention three things, and we'll discuss them later. First, the moral sense makes us more aware of the moral norms that guide the lives of everyday citizens. Only with great difficulty, of course, can government policy create these norms, but is distressingly capable of undermining these norms. And there are many things that public policy can do over the long run to reinforce them. That's one of the underlying themes of broken windows and community policing. Order maintenance is also maintenance of norms of acceptable social behavior. Just as importantly, laws influence what we as citizens consider noble and shameful. This is a key theme of Wilson's writing on drug abuse. Drug addiction, he argues, is not just an individual choice, but in many cases a dulling and even an extinguishing of our moral sensibility. Political communities present this, if they present it as one of many lifestyle choices, they do so at their peril. Fortunately, as Jim pointed out, Jim Wilburn pointed out, Jim Wilson laid out some of the policy implications of this in his 1985 essay, The Rediscovery of Character, which should become required reading at every public policy school. Second, since public policy involves teaching people about the implementation of public policy, students need to understand the government institutions that do this implementing. As Wilson's writing on bureaucracy and voluntary organization show, we can't understand the political process if we ignore human beings' inclination to make moral judgments, to sympathize with those like themselves, to become angry about perceived injustice, and to demonstrate solidarity with their peers. In retrospect, you can see Wilson's critique of Melnick Olson in political organizations and his critique of Anthony Downs in bureaucracy, that these were important parts of his effort to develop a fuller picture of human motivation that he developed in greater length in the moral sense. With apologies to the poet William Wordsworth, I would describe this as intimations of morality from recollections of earlier political science work. Finally, the moral sense can serve as a useful antidote to our students' rather inchoate yet immovable attachment to being non-judgmental. In fact, my students are so devoted to being non-judgmental that they judge very harshly. Indeed, they become furious with those who insist upon making moral judgments. My repeated effort to show them that this position is problematic usually produces only bewildered stares. The moral sense offers both an extended discussion of why we human beings inevitably make moral judgments, why this is good for us, and why the Enlightenment provides us with only an ambiguous legacy. In other words, it forces students to confront one of the central dogmas of contemporary democratic life. In conclusion, policy schools are great at getting people to think like economists, and there are many, many advantages to this. But James Q. Wilson's work shows us what it means for man to be a political animal, not solely an economic creature, maximizing its own individual utility. The best examinations of public policy issue will engage men and women in full. Thank you.
Thanks, Shep. John?
Well, thank you. It's a real special treat. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone in this room. I'm grateful to Jim Wilburn. I express my thanks to Jim and to his colleagues as well for bringing us all together at this spectacular conference. Being here with my friends, the esteemed Bill and the incredible Shep is on this panel is a special treat and honor as well. And being here with my beloved, I'll say our beloved, I'll share you this morning, Roberta, is really a special blessing as well. So thank you. Well, for 32 years, Jim Wilson was my mentor and my friend, and for about 24 of those years, I had the privilege of co-authoring his textbook, and it is his textbook, the great American government textbook that Jim wrote back in the 70s. So I knew him well and learned just about everything I know that's of any value from him. And I've shared some of my favorite stories and memories and anecdotes about Jim and special moments in various memorials and essays and in some of the previous conferences that were mentioned, including the wonderful conference that Shep co-organized at Boston College and Harvard last year. So at the risk of repeating one of these stories that I know some of you have heard, and one of Jim's favorites as well, but I think a story that may be particularly apt as a way in to frame my remarks this morning and for our topic at hand. Let me tell you just one about my being a graduate student at Harvard in, I think it was 1982. And I'm a South Philly boy, and I went home as much as I possibly could. Cambridge was not exactly South Philly, and in food and other ways. And so I'd go home as much as possible. And you know, every time I'd come home, I have 7 lifelong friends, car mechanic, a plumber, a pipe fitter, and they're still my lifelong buddies. And one of them, my friend Stevie's a car mechanic, came home in 1982 and he sees me coming and gives me the usual treatment. Oh, here he comes again, the professional student, right? When are you going to get a job, you bum? You know, what are you doing what are you doing up there? And I said, you know, so usually I would just let it go, but I figured this time I'm going to, you know, let them know how important I feel I'm becoming. So I said, well, you know, Steve, I said, you know, I'm you know, at Harvard, it's a pretty good place. Working with this guy named James Q. Wilson, and he's a famous, wonderful academic, and he actually wrote this book called Thinking About Crime, and he's rewriting it now. He's revising it, and so I'm helping him. I'm doing a little fact checking for him, and so you know, he wrote this book, Thinking About Crime, in 1975. He's revising Thinking About Crime now. So my friend Stevie pulls back and says, you know, Johnny, that's the problem with you. You go to Harvard, you get hooked up with this guy Wilson, and he's always thinking about crime. Why doesn't he just do it? Well, why not? Indeed. And why don't more of us cheat on our taxes? Be careful, this is being recorded. Why don't more of us, none of us, why don't we shirk, subvert, and steal at work, even when we know, have every rational reason to believe that we in fact can get away with it? Why don't even many federal bureaucrats, why don't they shirk, subvert, and steal? Why do so many federal bureaucrats, much maligned, but go above and beyond the call of duty, behave in public-spirited ways? Why does society have not only its free riders, but also its freedom riders? And why is it that we reflexively praise the freedom riders, or people who behave in a pro-social, pro-civic, other regarding way, and almost reflexively tisk the free riders? Jim Wilson had answers to these questions, and he was, as Harvey Mansfield and others wrote right after Jim's passing a couple years ago in one of the tributes to Jim, Jim was above all a student of the morality of character. But I don't think Jim knew that or fully appreciated it himself until about 25 or 30 years into his own career. In 1991, so going back a bit, Jim became the president of the American Political Science Association, and the association asked me at that time to write a biographical essay on Jim's life and career academic corpus. And I agreed, and I entitled it James Q. Wilson and Civic Virtue. And if you'll pardon the self-quotation, here's how it began. James Q. Wilson knows many things, but the one big thing he knows, or has spent the better part of the past 3 decades as researcher, teacher, and member of numerous high-level government commissions seeking to know, is the wellsprings of civic virtue, the political and other conditions under which good citizens are produced, bad citizens are corrected, and desirable human characters are made to flourish. For Wilson, being a student of crime, like being a student of politics, means being a student of civic virtue, or more precisely, of the processes by which good character is or is not formed in the citizenry. 2 years later, in 1993, of course, Jim published The Moral Sense. And when he published it, he said he did so as, quote, not to make you look dumb. As Shep pointed out, Jim considered The Moral Sense to be his most important book. And between 1993 and 2000, Jim published 2 other works with the title, or with the word moral in the title. One in 1997, a book called Moral Judgment, and then his Zetterberg lectures at the University of Stockholm in 2000 under the title Moral Intuitions. Now, of course, Jim had not been mum on morality in the preceding 25 or 30 years. Many books and articles that Jim wrote pre-1993 were punctuated by moral prose. Here, for example, is how he concluded both the first edition in 1975 and that second edition in 1983 of Thinking About Crime. Quote, some persons will shun crime even if we do nothing to deter them, while others will seek it out even if we do everything to reform them. Wicked people exist, and many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their opportunities, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a cue to what they might profitably do. We have trifled with the wicked, made sport of the innocent, and encouraged the calculators. Justice suffers, and so do we all. Whereas Jim's moral prose in that final paragraph of Thinking About Crime reminds us that wicked people exist, his moral poetry, really, in the final paragraph of The Moral Sense reminds us that we are not wired, however, to be wicked. Here is that concluding paragraph from The Moral Sense. Mankind's moral sense is not a strong beacon light, radiating outward to illuminate in sharp outline all that it touches. It is rather a small candle, casting vague and multiple shadows, flickering and sputtering in the strong winds of power and passion, greed and ideology, but brought close to the heart and cupped in one's hands, it dispels the darkness and warms the soul. Who knew that our boy Jim was a poet too, eh, Roberta? Mm-hmm. As Jim defined it, the moral sense is the uniquely human physical property shared by we, big-brained, carbon-based life forms, evolved through natural selection that makes people, all places, fit and inclined to become faithful spouses, responsible parents, good neighbors, community-spirited volunteers, public-spirited bureaucrats, and civic-minded citizens. Fit and inclined, that is, if they are not rendered unfit and disinclined by perverse habituation, or made callous, craven, or criminal by life within a barbaric or decadent culture or subculture, or forced by floods or famines or other survival-threatening fixes to survive by being selfish or even feral. Even criminals, Jim quipped, believe in morality, at least as they get older, and so they do. But Jim was very precise and clear in his language in The Moral Sense. One of the things that I think was most remarkable about this book, and I came along with Shep as well, trading in bureaucracy now is number 2 behind The Moral Sense after all this rereading. He was very careful and precise in his language about what the moral sense was and wasn't, what he was saying, what he wasn't saying. To quote just one passage here that I think illustrates that point, Jim wrote, and I quote, "To say that people have a moral sense is not to say that it's not the same thing as saying that they are innately good. A moral sense must compete with other senses that are natural to humans. The desire to survive, acquire possessions, indulge in sex, or accumulate power. In short, with self-interest narrowly defined. How that struggle is resolved will depend on our character, our circumstances, and the cultural and political tendencies of the day. But saying that a moral sense exists is the same thing as saying that humans, by their nature, are potentially good." But what is meant by potentially good and good character? Jim's University of Chicago mentor, eventual Harvard colleague, and lifelong dear friend was Edward C. Banfield, the great Edward C. Banfield. And Jim conceptualized character pretty much exactly as Ed Banfield had, namely in relation to what they called two dispositions, empathy and self-control. By empathy, and I'm quoting Jim's, or paraphrasing Jim's own words here, of course, by empathy, he meant willingness to take importantly into account the rights, needs, and feelings of others. By self-control, he meant willingness to take importantly into account the more distant consequences of present actions, to be, in short, somewhat future-oriented rather than wholly present-oriented. Jim's endnote to these definitions actually is a reference to Aristotle. And the footnote reads, just, quote, Aristotle's ethics supplies a fuller list, close quote. In Jim's understanding, I think he sort of was asking the question, how or what are the conditions under which good character, thus defined, occurs, and how, if at all, do given social customs or conventions and or given public laws and policies predictably and reliably influence or foster or frustrate its occurrence. There were, I think, four paths that Jim walked, and sometimes walked them, more than one of them at the same time, which he was capable of doing. Aristotle definitely was one. Aristotle's notion of habituation, that man when perfected is the best of animals, but if he is isolated from law and justice, he's the worst of all. If you're to become good, you have to be first trained and habituated accordingly and properly, and then in the spirit thus engendered, do nothing base or mean, willingly or unwillingly. There was Aristotle, and then in the caboose came David Hume and Adam Smith. So there was Aristotle with a tip of the hat to those bonny thinkers. There was common sense, and common sense for Jim, I believe, was always something like the man from Missouri who has to be shown. It was the average citizen who could not possibly be persuaded, no matter how many criminologists said so, that locking up a high-rate, violent repeat offender would not keep the guy's sister safer. There was also, of course, social science, about which Jim had a number of different views over the years, but in which he ultimately did believe, perhaps not with any great, I think, absolute fidelity, but certainly more than, say, his own mentor, Ed Banfield, did. And then, of course, natural science, which really is summarized, his thinking and research on that summarized most brilliantly and beautifully in The Moral Sense. So there were these four paths. I want to say a few words about natural science, that path, and then say a couple of words about one path that Jim walked, but only with great ambivalence, and Shep anticipated this, having to do with Jim's thinking about religion and religious sensibilities. While The Moral Sense was Jim's grand summation of his thinking about how natural science seemed to help the quest to understand, if not to know how to change, observed variance in moral behavior, the high watermark, I really think, of Jim's belief in natural science, or as a path to understanding, really came earlier. It came in the mid-1980s, in particular in his book with his good friend, the great psychologist at Harvard, Richard Herrnstein, their 1985 book, Crime and Human Nature, which had a subtitle that made Jim wince, but I think it might have helped the marketing, The Definitive Understanding of the Causes of Crime, which he never liked, but that subtitle. But it was the definitive understanding of the causes of crime. And it included both constitutional, as in physical, biochemical, biological basis of factors, as well as all of the traditional sociology of crime and so forth. But in a nutshell, by the early 1990s, I think Jim had begun to think that maybe the old liberal root causes, bad boys from bad homes sociology of crime, as well as the economics, really, of crime, the economics of calculating criminals with bad incentives that he himself had kind of brought back into the fold with thinking about crime, that these two paths, as it were, to understanding from the social sciences were not, in fact, markedly less successful than the biogenetics of crime in being able to explain, predict, and know how to understand, curtail, or control criminal behavior. Knowing that his friend John DiIulio was a mesomorph with a deficiency of endomorphy was good. Worrying about dopamine and testosterone levels was good. But the more Jim studied and learned about this, the more he realized, and I think the more the research gave him to believe that there was not quite as much there as had originally, I think, met his eye. And as he began to delve even more deeply into natural science scholarship, he began to discern that the super specialized hard sciences disciplines, as fascinating as they could be, as much as they could contribute, and as important as they were, really were no intellectual promised lands. For one thing, key concepts and findings in these disciplines turned out in many cases to be as squishy or as suspect or as subject to multiple and competing interpretations as key concepts and findings in the so-called social sciences. Jim never lost hope that the hard sciences could illuminate significant empirical truths relating to or explaining and predicting nice, naughty, and notorious behavior. But he felt fairly certain that everything from criminal propensities to political proclivities could be explained in part by biological traits and genetic profiles. But in the end, he didn't think we were even close to understanding really how, say, good character is influenced by good chemistry or the like. As he wrote to me in May 2009, genes, quote, operate mysteriously, and causal genes must be activated by other genes. No one is quite sure how this happens. As he recognized, this meant not only that the interaction between the so-called social and constitutional factors, per his 1985 rendering with Richard Herrnstein, was not terribly well understood, but that in many cases the so-called constitutional factors also intra-acted in ways that had yet to be understood well or at all. Even the very concept of gene itself. There was a famous American Scientist magazine cover, What is a Gene? Here we're completing the Human Genome Project, and suddenly it's like, the more we know, the less we know. So being Jim, of course, he took full stock of that. Also, and in conjunction, during his final few years, Jim seemed, I think, ever more prone to wonder whether, putting the empirical part of this aside, whether he might have been skating on somewhat cracked normative ice when, for example, he trumpeted the Big Bang to biophysical bases of behavior explanations, and yet still preached very strongly that jurists ought to, for example, toss out the Twinkie defense on its ear, not empirically credible, but also to toss out other more empirically credible abuse excuse arguments. So he began to sort of wrestle with that a bit, and I knew he was wrestling strongly when he called me one day and asked me whether I had ever read Isaiah Berlin. I knew that he was having second thoughts. Jim would be, given my theology, I will say Jim is, delighted to know that we are here parsing the moral sense in relation to ideas about how, if at all, public policy education, schools, curricula might reform or reconstitute themselves in ways that constitute intellectual and civic progress. But let me just conclude with a couple of points and reminders, and I'll turn my motor off. Let's remember that Jim, even in the book that I think both Shep and I thought was the magnum opus #1 until we reread and got closer to the moral sense again, even in bureaucracy, right, scintillatingly subtitled What Government Agencies Do and Why They Do It, in the opening pages, Jim says to his readers, this book has neither theoretical nor practical significance. If you read this book, you will learn little or nothing that will help you to reform actual bureaucracies in real time. However, it will help you understand certain puzzles that are intellectually interesting, and that should be reward enough. It has been for me for 30 years. Well, I rarely say that my mentor was wrong, but I think he was wrong about that. I've spent most of the last 30 years myself teaching in one or another or running one or another MPA or graduate professional public policy program, research centers, and so forth. And I know people who have read that book, used that book as part of their core curriculum, as well as used it in training sessions for people who have benefited from it and gone out and solved in real time actual problems. So I think Jim, I won't say gave himself too little credit, but I think the book actually had more practical and intellectual value than he perhaps allowed for. There was one path, however, that Jim was ambivalent about walking, as I said, and that was the path of religion. And 9 years after The Moral Sense, Jim published a book called The Marriage Problem. And he noted that, and I quote, today many people are facing a challenge for which they are utterly unprepared, a vast urban world of personal freedom, bureaucratized services, cheap sex, and easy divorce. Unprepared probably isn't quite the extent of it. As Jim stated in the book's closing pages, to understand the benefits of the commitment that is marriage, one has to be, well, a grown-up. But not everyone is grown up. When Jim tried to make the case that one ought to behave as a grown-up, when he was reaching for reasons to explain, for example, to the 28-year-old guy living in Manhattan in a hookup culture with no particular desire for younglings and no particular desire to contribute to the Commonwealth, why it is that he ought to get involved in grown-up behavior or to discipline himself in grown-up behavior, Jim reached back not to the moral sense and to science, but to revealed religion. In The Marriage Problem, he says, makes a concluding case for grown-up marriage. He writes, quote, "The religious backbone of the cultural change movement has largely disappeared among elites. An openly religious movement to alter human character is called by the media right-wing Christian fundamentalism. But research has suggested that religious orientation is in fact a powerful force for helping people despite adverse economic circumstances." And there's a footnote to that, and the footnote to that is the various studies that don't actually deal with religion and marriage, they deal with religion and crime, and there were actually studies that Jim and other writings expressed skepticism about. But what he was doing, I think, was reaching back, as it were, or going down a path that he normally did not walk. In all of his writings on crime, he, especially in the work with Richard Herrnstein, they say near the end of the book, the single most important but least well-researched topic in the study of crime and human behavior is the role of religion in reducing or how it relates to deviance and criminal behavior. This is terribly under-researched. More research is needed. So what would I say then, giving you this little kind of algorithm of Jim's 4 paths and one path that he sometimes walked, but walked with a great deal of ambivalence with regard to public policy education. I'm tempted to say that rather than get a public policy education, one should read under supervision or with a tutorial the Wilson corpus and be done with it. But I'm not going to say that because that would put you and me out of business. So I'm not going to go there. But what I would say is that Jim has a tremendous amount to contribute. And one of the things he contributes is a great deal of skepticism about research methods and the extent to which it's possible to teach people things in a public policy curriculum that they actually can go and do something productive with out in the world. In the end, I think the moniker that that I would put over Jim's entire body of work, including the moral sense, would come from Aristotle. You know, it's the mark of the educated person to seek precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. Thank you.
I think I'll tell one story about how Jim Wilson's work influenced me, short story, and then ask maybe a question of both Shep, a different question of Shep and of John, and then we can have a broader, ask them to answer that question / statement, challenge, and then ask you guys to answer that, and then we can have a broader discussion. I will say first, though, I was struck by Roberta's story about people coming up to her and asking what Jim thinks about X or Y, that this was a pet peeve. My wife, Susan, actually is equally, it's a pet peeve of hers. This happens all the time in Washington at some reception or whatever, and people come up to Susan and say, what does Bill think about whatever's in the news of the day? And she used to be like Roberta and just politely demure, but then she got more exasperated. And so she now tells people the opposite of what she thinks I think. A certain number of people are confused then when they, say, I was a student of Jim's. It wasn't. I didn't become a political scientist. That wasn't quite the same relationship that Shep and John had with him. But I really appreciated Jim's work. When I went to work in government in 1985, I left the Kennedy School. Went to work for Bill Bennett in the second term of the Reagan administration. Bill asked me to come work for the education department. And I was going to be a specialist. I was a special assistant, really speechwriter, kind of counselor. Did that for a few months, and then there was, for various reasons, various people changed jobs, and Bill asked me to be his chief of staff, and suddenly that's a sort of more serious job, and you're helping run a department, and it was just the education department. We're not talking about the defense department here or anything like that, but still, from my point of view, it was a few thousand people, and at that time, about a $20 billion budget, and so I thought, gee, I better study up on this. So I read various books on education policy and articles and conferred with all kinds of experts on education and on the current debates on policy. And then when I really started having to do things as Bill's chief of staff, I remember there was a moment about a month or two in where I had this sort of light bulb go off in my head, and that I was thinking about how to handle something and sort of running through how something would work out in practice and the bureaucratic incentives. And I realized that I had, thank God, more than I sort of realized, internalized Jim's bureaucracy book. But actually for me it wasn't the book, because I took Jim's course I think it was as a freshman at Harvard in the fall of 1970. on bureaucracy, Gov 150, I think it was called at the time. And he hadn't published the book yet, though the course was basically the book, I mean, the preparation for the book. And at the time, I enjoyed the course. Jim was an excellent lecturer. Most of the readings weren't terribly good. That's because there weren't that many good things written on bureaucracy before Jim's book. And so I thought, well, the readings are kind of silly, but the lectures are excellent. And I took the course and I think did okay, but I mean, I didn't go on in that field as an undergraduate or a graduate student much. And it was amazing how much came back to me, I've got to say. I'm not saying I was particularly great as a chief of staff or anything, but to the degree I didn't totally mess up and did have some understanding and was able to help other colleagues understand what might happen if the secretary said X or proposed Y, or what the likely reaction might be to something, some development out, in the country or on the Hill. I really, and it didn't just happen all at once either. There were moments over the next. I then went back and looked at the book and read parts of it, and over the next 2-3 years, I would say honestly, if you sort of asked me what one book or two helped me the most in making the transition. I'd never been in government, so the transition from being an academic to being in government, it was Jim's book on bureaucracy. So that along, I'd say, with Aaron Wildofsky's book, actually, which came out in the early 80s, I think, on sort of how to think about public policy. I don't know if that book has the recognition and stature it deserves in public policy schools. I'm going to guess not. But I happened to have read it because I was coming to the Kennedy School at that point, and I thought, I should know something about public policy and management and implementation, and read Aaron Wildofsky's book, which turned out to be totally orthogonal to 98% of what was done at public policy schools. Mark Moore appreciated it, but I'm not sure how many other people at the Kennedy School did. But those two books, I would say, were actually the most helpful for me. So I've always had a particularly fond spot in my heart for the bureaucracy book, with all due respect to the Moral Sense book as well. So now let me ask. So for Shep, I guess my question is: it seems to me, if you really think about Jim Wilson's work, I mean, he wore his learning actually very lightly, I would say. I mean, there are plenty of footnotes in the book, but the degree to which he had thought about these things seriously, read a lot of serious classical texts, he tended to mute that, I would say, in his own presentation. But I do think ultimately his work is a very deep critique of what I guess Oakeshott called rationalism in politics, and Hayek calls the fatal conceit, and others discuss this kind of modern rationalistic attempt at planning and control, and the notion that you mentioned implementation, Shep, that's just one aspect of that not thinking through the complexity of governmental structures, say nothing of the whole society in which one is operating, unanticipated consequences, all that sort of thing. I mean, Jim didn't do it from top down the way you might say Hayek and Oakeshott and others did, it seems to me, or even Banfield to some degree, I think. It was more of they had sort of worked out the theoretical reason why certain things weren't going to work the way experts and planners thought they might. But Jim was more bottom up. And this is, an honest question. I mean, how much effect has that had as that general critique had in political science, in public policy? I mean, I'm personally very sympathetic to it. Maybe some people would say, well, it shouldn't have that much effect, because it turns out rationalism, modern rationalism is working just great in planning public policy. But I'm curious, just since you follow this stuff much more than I do, how much that aspect of Jim's work has had a real influence, and if it has, how, and if it hasn't, maybe why not? Or am I wrong in characterizing it in this way? For John, I guess my question, motivated by his remarks, is, well, I'd say, what footnote the alternative to rationalism, or modern rationalism, in politics is not irrationalism, needless to say. It's just a more complex and understanding of the limits of applying reason directly, or a certain kind of reason directly to politics. So I'm not making the case here for irrationalism. That seems to be doing great, but out there in the country as well. Rationalism is doing great, and irrationalism is doing great. Actually thinking and having sensible judgments, not so much. But maybe Shep will explain to me why this is the case, if I'm right about that. I mean, I guess on John's thesis, or the last part of your argument, Jim called for more research on the effects of what, I don't know if you said revealed religion, but I'll just say the religious orientation, which was actually the phrase you quoted there, on character, and therewith on public policy. I mean, has there been much more research? Are people interested in doing it? Is it being done in a sensible way? Is it being done in a way that isn't simply a kind of cultural war, either debunking of all religious faith or faithful belief in religious faith? And where do things stand on this empirical sort of set of questions and studies that Jim seemed to think were very important. So that's my question for Shep is on rationalism, and for John is on moralism.
We weren't alerted to these questions, so this is
Yeah,
completely
no.
off the cuff. I might start with that with a contrast that I think John developed in an earlier talk between Jim Wilson and Ed Banfield. I think John and I both went to Ed Banfield's course on public policy analysis. And Ed's position, basically, this is completely worthless. That I'm going to show you the flaws of all of these approaches studying public policy, and that will lead you not to worry about them later. I was actually a bit put off of this, I must say. I think the contrast is that certainly Jim Wilson shared Ed Banfield's great sense of caution and skepticism. But he thought that social science and natural science had something very important to say about public policy. So if you used it cautiously, it could be extremely valuable. Now, in some ways that really begs the question. Of course, we should use everything cautiously. So to what extent could kind of rational analysis of public policy improve public policy? And I think this is, in some ways, I think one of the hardest things to get a hold of Jim's work. In some ways, it's a great, there was a famous line that John quoted that bureaucracy is neither a practical nor a theoretical book. But as Bill pointed out, I think people who have operated in bureaucracies find it to be an extraordinary useful book. And I know that students of mine who have read the book and then gone and work in the federal or state government have come back and say that is the book that they learned most from. So why is that? And I would say, what can we as political scientists, policy analysts teach people that is really useful? And I think one of the things that you find in that book, in all of Jim's work, is this stress on you've got to be aware of the variety of circumstances that you face. There are a variety of bureaucracies, a variety of problems. There are varieties of police behavior. And so how can we understand this great variety and to classify them some ways to make this very complicated human world more understandable and more susceptible to the things that we can do to change them. Let me this doesn't really address the largest issue, but I would say here's an example of where Bill's question really becomes important related to the moral sense, which is, what do we do about the fact that we know that families in this country are in very serious trouble? And that the fact we have so many single-parent families, the fact that we have so many children who are not brought up in households where they learn these basic things about self-control, that is a very serious problem. Should government do anything about it? One possibility is to say, the more government does, the more we're going to weaken families. But that wasn't Jim's approach. He said there are many things that we can do, visiting nurses, preschool, that can help make up for some of the deficiencies of families and to help people become better parents. And I think but of course, this really goes to the other side, which is let's not exaggerate the ability of government to do this on a large scale. To use a contemporary example, maybe it's probably not a good idea in New York City to have universal pre-K. It would be a better idea to try to have some small programs, find out what works best, and target them. So that's, I think, the type of combination of caution and hopefulness of the role of government that forms that middle way.
Well, let me ask a sort of follow-up. I always like varieties of police behavior. I think someone else has made this point actually as the title in particular, because it does, A, it's just kind of amusing, but B, it does imply that all the varieties can't sort of be reduced to one axis or one, the way economists or economic type thinking would tend to do, that there are these actually different kinds of behavior, which would, maybe all of them are somewhat legitimate, and they are trade-offs among them and reflect different aspects of human nature and of political organization and so forth. But it does seem to me, that for all the caution, there's maybe there's a little more caution after the last couple of 2, 3, 4 years about big grand social engineering, though I don't know. how much there is on the left, or even honestly on the right, where there's still this tendency to fall in love with, you know, the plans of conservative think tanks as opposed to liberal think tanks, and pretend you could just figure out all the effects and consequences of a massive reshaping of current policies in a libertarian direction as opposed to a more government control direction. But I mean, it seems to me it's been so Cass Sunstein, all this nudge and all, which I guess on the surface, I have particular hostility to this, so you'll indulge this for 45 seconds, but on the surface looks more cautious than massive social engineering. But I do think it's ultimately exactly as rationalist in the worst sense, and sort of conceited in a sense as other thinking. I mean, it just seems to me there that Jim's, am I wrong? I mean, have people really thought through the implications of Jim's work in this respect, do you think, either in public policy schools, to get to the question Jim Wilburn asked us to address in this conference as a whole, or in political science, or in actual public life?
I'll just make two quick responses. First is, I think, the varieties of police behavior approach. You can see that in the moral sense, because there are a variety of human motivations, and they're at war with each other, in the section that John wrote. And I mean, for social scientists, this is extremely frustrating, because we want to have one thing we can look at and maximize and make predictions on. But Jim Wilson's work is a much more complicated world, where we have all of these competing motivations that we don't know which one is going to be driving action at any particular point. On your other point about some of the recent work on behavioral economics, my daughter is a student at Henry Brady's Berkeley School of Public Policy, and she's telling me things I should read. So she had me reading Dan Kahneman, if I pronounced it right,
Kahneman.
Thinking Fast and Slow, which is really a wonderful book. And what I was struck by, since I was reading that at the same time I was rereading The Moral Sense, is what the current trend in behavioral economics and the Cass Sunstein approach really kind of is the limit of our conceptual apparatus, and how we can correct that. So if we know that people almost always choose the default option, we can manipulate the default option. And there is a certain amount of ambitiousness about how we can take people's limited conceptual abilities into account and produce better public policy. I was struck by this is not incompatible with what Jim wrote in The Moral Sense, but The Moral Sense is about something that is not conceptualization. It is about a whole other types of motivation and thinking. And I think it strikes me as the combination of the two is what is needed in getting us to think about human behavior. And that moving away from our simple models will make us better social scientists. But just my final thought was, given what I know about political science, and given the incredible pressure for producing short articles with definitive results, that's going to be a hard sell within professions.
Yeah, the behavioral economists seem to be very struck by the limits of other people's rationality,
Right, yeah,
correctly,
yeah.
but not so much by the limits of their own ability to manipulate other people's lack of rationality. But John?
So, this is fascinating, and you know, The Moral Sense is a complicated book, and Jim was a very complicated thinker. It's really hard to reduce, as I said, you know, Jim always said, if you want better answers, ask better questions. And sometimes questions invite many different ways of answering them. But in The Moral Sense, I think it's important to realize that Jim was struggling with something much deeper than what has natural science taught us about the conditions under which you get certain kinds of behavior. Let me quote just very quickly from what I think is really the main, the core motivation. He's early in the book, he's talking about how it is, we have developed a society today where most people have what he calls an instinctive and commendable tolerance of other people's views. But he says, this has made a number of us, quote, flinch from answering moral questions, at least in public, and to, quote, shun any appearance of imposing one's religious convictions upon others. Again, religion comes up. Then he writes this. I'll quote because I think it's just exactly on point here. Quote, if modern man had taken seriously the main intellectual currents of the last half century or so, he would have found himself confronted by the need to make moral choices when the very possibility of making such choices had been denied. God is dead or silent, reason suspect or defective, nature meaningless or hostile. As a result, man is adrift on an uncharted sea, left to find his moral bearings with no compass and no pole star, and so able to do little more than utter personal preferences, bow to historical necessity, or accept social conventions. Countless writers have assumed that man is precisely in this predicament, but if this were true, then my argument that there are in human nature the elements of a moral sense would be untrue. And so my argument is true, and therefore to the rescue. The problem with that is that in the end, and Jim and I talked about this a fair amount on and off over the years, but especially on and off in the last few years of his life. You know, we have two eyes in the front of our head. They're there courtesy of Big Bang to biophysical nature and natural selection. I can use those two eyes the better to see you with, my dears, hunt you down, or I can use them to help search for a missing child. And natural selection is absolutely, evolution is absolutely, it has no dog or quark or human being in the fight for survival. And so this is where the point about, the normative cracked ice. Now, people have, I think, in answer to Bill's question, come along in behind. There's been, for example, an explosion of research. I don't think the faith-based initiative accomplished all that we wanted, but it certainly has led to a lot more research on the subject. Academics are doing better. I'm not sure that average people are doing much better. But Jim was skeptical of that research, skeptical of it to the point where not that long before he passed, he did a review of a book in the Wall Street Journal, of a book that claimed that it had sort of parsed several hundred studies showing more God, less crime. And Jim's point was, right, Mark, ambiguous, these are not, you've got selection bias problems all over the place, jump ball. I mean, Jim was not prepared to pronounce that science had, answered the question about the relationship between even something as important and basic to him as the relationship between, religion and crime. I think Jim went to natural science because the social science path, in some sense, and this is a great sweeping overgeneralization, but was blocked. Shep mentioned, and it's come up a couple times, the relationship and the differences between Jim and his great mentor, the great Ed Banfield. I think I was among the last students to take courses with both Wilson and Banfield at the same time. And so I would go to Professor Wilson, and I was telling Roberta this last night, and Professor Wilson would tell me how I had to be, at least, conversant, if not fluent in statistics, and I had to worry about research design. I had a theory build. Can you imagine, right? And then I'd go to Professor Banfield, and he'd say, not with a hand wave, but he'd give very, profound reasons why. And one day I went to Professor Banfield and I was pressing him. I said, but Professor Wilson says, and Professor Banfield cast an eye on me right before he invited me to dinner, which was very nice of him, and he said, ask your Professor Wilson whether he thinks you need a theory of kinship to be a good cousin, right? I, of course, never asked Professor Wilson that question, but it was a serious dispute. Jim believed in social science to a degree, but he also believed that there were limits even to the best methods in social science empirically, and that there was a tendency to become not only relativistic, but nihilistic. So the methodological points which Shep addressed in his remarks and have been addressed by others, Jim gave a tremendous talk when Harvey Mansfield chaired a committee that, and I happened to have the privilege of being on, that awarded Jim the James Madison Award of the American Political Science Association. And in Jim's remarks there, he talked about the studies of voting behavior. And he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, let me see if I understand what political science has done here. We can't explain why people vote at all, because voting is an irrational act, because your vote's not going to affect the outcome of the election unless you think that a hurricane going through a junkyard is going to leave a Cadillac behind in its wake, right? So it'd be irrational to vote. But when people do go and vote, those who do go and vote, we analyze their voting behavior according to how close it is to their being able to figure out their own ideals and interests in relation to politics, right? So they vote rationally. So he said, let me see if I understand this. People go in irrational, they come out rational, which makes the voting booth the most effective mental hospital in the world. This is in his Madison address. And so Jim was skeptical about how much the fanciest formal methods had taken us, but he was even more, I think, profoundly concerned about the kind of relativism and nihilism, not just the ideological bias, that people talk about a lot in the debates that surrounded in particular his work on crime, but the idea that this is a field where everybody is objective and follows the fact-value distinction, except that they have sort of the nihilism that asks that people believe not only in nothing, but in their particular brand of nothing, right? And I think that was most distressing. So I think that the moral sense represents both an intellectual quest for empirical understanding, but an attempt to get us away from this, this instinctive and commendable tolerance, not having it result in our inability to feel that we're just making arbitrary statements and have arbitrary preferences, that there is no better and worse, higher and lower.